Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Analytics and the Academic Library webinar. My name is Kimberly Brown Harden, and I'm the Northwest Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the host and question moderator today. Our presenter this morning is Kyle Jones, Assistant Professor, Indiana University, Indianapolis, IUPUI, School of Informatics and Computing Department of Library and Information Science. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few announcements. This webinar is part of our Topics in Academic Library series. To register for other webinars available for this theme or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. For a full list of our current in-person training menu, please see our continuing education website. The Indiana State Library has many ways we try to stay connected to library staff across the state. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word. We also offer a blog which provides information about the Indiana State Collection, interview spotlights on library staff from across the state, and information about upcoming events at the Indiana State Library. If you have a question, just type it in the chat box on the upper left side of the screen. I'll be watching and will get your question to Kyle as soon as there's a good opportunity. There should also be time near the end for questions. This session is 1 hour, so you'll get one LEU for the day. After the webinar, you will see a link to the LEU. Please download the LEU. Click on the link, press download, and you can print it out and sign your name. Also near the end in the chat box, there will be a link to today's survey. Please take a brief survey about this webinar. It helps us to offer more trainings. If at any point during the webinar you experience any sound issues, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box on the left side of the screen. If there is a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat pod. If you are unable to resolve the sound issues you are experiencing, we are recording the meeting and you can watch it offline after the meeting has ended. Again, if there is a global sound issue, we will make an announcement in the chat box. I will now turn the mic over to Kyle.
Good morning, everybody, or I should say nearly noon. Happy lunchtime for you all. My name is Kyle Jones, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Library and Information Science at IUPUI. And today I'm going to be talking about something that's near and dear to me as part of my research agenda, which is learning analytics in the academic library. And specifically, we're going to dive into what some of the intellectual freedom and informational privacy issues are. So first off, just a little bit about me. So as I said, I'm an assistant professor. I'm fairly new to Indy. And if there's anything here that I talk about that you want to follow up with me on, feel free to find me at my website, which is thecorkboard.org, or at Twitter at thecorkboard, or feel free to email me. I love to talk about this subject. I love to talk about some of the ethical issues involved with it. And I think it's always interesting to me, as I was telling Kimberly before we began today, it's always interesting to me to speak with professionals about their own issues and kind of get outside of the ivory tower, as it were. My research is also at my website at thecorkboard.org, or if you can type in this highly complicated URL right here, you can find me on SSRN, which is, I believe, the Social Science Research Network. And I'll also give these slides to Kimberly so that she can distribute them. I have absolutely no issues with that. So a little bit about my research agenda so you understand where I'm coming from. So I look at big data analytics technologies through a critical lens. I'm not a techno-utopian. I don't necessarily like to promote technology all that much. especially when I believe it has some pretty serious ethical issues. So I'm particularly interested in student privacy issues, student information policy issues that affect students, and other ethical issues. So concerns about paternalism, I've written on that. I'm interested in questions of justice and fairness, and also other ethical questions related to self-determination and the way that some of these technologies influence one's ability to determine one's future. So the goal of my research is really to develop policy and inform technological design in these areas. I'm not a Luddite. I love technology. I just think there are some situations where we don't need to promote it so heavily, and this is one of those situations where I think we need to be a little bit critical. So about the work that I'm going to present here. So this is based off of a paper that I wrote for college and research libraries that you can find as a preprint at their website. It's also at my website. You can get access to it via that page, thecorkboard.org/research. And I wrote this with Dorothea Salo, who's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where I earned my PhD. And it's an information ethics style critique. It's not an empirical piece. I don't, for this particular project, I didn't go out into the field and talk to people like yourselves who are dealing with some of these issues perhaps, or are starting to think about using learning analytics in their library, or understand that their administrators are looking to use learning analytics in the institution. It's more of looking at this from an ethical perspective. And really the goal of this paper, and also the goal of this webinar, I should say, is to kind of seed some larger questions about the role of learning analytics in academic libraries and how these things may not match up well with our professional ethics, and kind of get us to think through how we're going to resolve some of those ethical sticky points. Though I am doing an empirical project right now by interviewing academic librarians to kind of address some of these things. And if you're interested in participating in an interview, please let me know. I'm always looking for participants. So before I get to the presentation outline, I just want to thank the Indiana State Library for inviting me here today. This is a very nice privilege to be able to talk to you all, and I hope you find this information to be useful. Here is how the presentation will go. So first, I'm going to give you a high-level overview of what learning analytics is. And I say that singular because I talk about learning analytics as kind of an agenda. Learning analytics in higher education. We'll talk a little bit there about the purposes, the ends, the goals of learning analytics, and I'll also focus in on what the information and data sources are for this educational data mining technology. And then we will dig more specifically into academic libraries and learning analytics. So we'll talk about how some academic libraries on the cutting edge are beginning to use learning analytics, and what they have found from their work in this area. And then we'll get into what I think is the fun stuff, which is the professional ethics conflicts, before getting into some implications for LIS. Maybe education, which is what I'm interested in, but also we'll talk about the implications for LIS practitioners, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. Hopefully I don't ramble on too much and we can have a nice 15 or 20-minute discussion. I do want to say at any time you can interrupt me and ask questions, and Kimberly will relay those to me. I'm perfectly fine with being interrupted. I would like this to be as casual as it can be. So, learning analytics in higher education. So what it is, its methods of surveillance, and some problems. So before we dig into the weeds here, I think we need to start off with a definition to kind of get us going in the same direction here. So this is a definition by George Siemens, who wrote this in a conference proceedings in 2012 for a title or a journal, I believe, called Learning Analytics, Envisioning a Research Discipline and a Domain of Practice. Some of you may be familiar with George Siemens' work. He was, I believe, the founder, really, of the massive open online course movement. He was in Canada before going to Austin, Texas, I believe now, and he's a major force in educational technology. And there are a lot of different definitions that we could pull from with learning analytics. It has different flavors depending on who talks about it. But if we were to do a citation analysis, this is the one that would come up the most. So let's talk about this. So Siemens says that learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning in the environments in which it occurs. That's a really long sentence. I would never write a sentence that long. So let's unpack that a little bit. So the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners. Okay, that provides us a focus. We're talking about students. We're talking about data about students. And what we're going to do with that data is we're going to put it through some type of analysis. We're going to, and before we can even analyze it, we have to collect it. We have to aggregate it. We have to get it in a form that makes it usable. All right, let's move on to the next part, which is data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning in the environment in which it occurs. What I always like to pull out of this definition is that nowhere in this definition does it state classroom. Nowhere in this definition does it state online learning, right? This is a very wide scope. I've talked with people about this definition and sometimes they disagree with me, but to me, we're talking about learning all over the campus, in digital spaces, in analog spaces, in the library, in the student union, in the bar, if your campus is lucky to have one, in campus resource centers like the Writing Center or some learning centers. Wherever learning may occur, learning analytics advocates are interested in getting the data that is created in those spaces and places. And that's very important. Also, what I want to pull out here is that it's not just about the learner. So it is about optimizing learning, but it's also for understanding the environments in which it occurs. And that's really important to pull out because when we get to a question about who is served by learning analytics, there is an outstanding question as to whether or not it's students who get the benefits or it's actually the institution that gets the benefits. Or we could even say the library that gets the benefits. So it may be that these things help us run an institution more efficiently and effectively, as I'll talk about. But that doesn't necessarily mean that students are learning more. I just want to make sure that I put that in your head a little bit. So let's talk about some of these end goals. And we could have a much larger conversation about these end goals, but I will try to make it particular and to the point here. So two general end goals of the institution. The first is economic and the second is more political. So the economic argument for using learning analytics is that it's going to help us unveil hidden cost savings. It's going to help us streamline operational practices and it's going to help us improve fiscal management. These are all things that many institutions, whether you're a small institution, a large institution, a private, a state-supported institution, or even a for-profit institution, everybody wants to save money. There's never enough money to go around. So how do we do this? Well, this is kind of gets back to the big data ethos, which is that if we have all of this data and we're able to analyze it and find out more about how people behave, well, then we can use that information to adjust our operations, to allocate resources differently, to do as it says in that second bullet point under economic, which is to streamline operational practices. And I always like to talk about this part because those who employ learning or deploy learning analytics technologies are going to have some kind of agenda behind that deployment. And that's just a natural part of technology, right? So we have to understand that administrators are going to have different goals that they want to accomplish than, say, instructors do with learning analytics. And it's the what I see in the literature, and based on conversations I've had with others in higher education, is that those in administrative roles are interested in the economic arguments or economic advantages that they may be able to get out of learning analytics. And this kind of ties into that second major theme, which is the political end goals. So if we have this data and we can improve our operational practices and we can gain more resources, or at least optimize them, then we can use that data to defend against accountability attacks that we often get in higher education, especially if we're state supported. We have legislators who come to our doors and wonder if we're actually achieving our goal and if we're using their money effectively. Some of these things relate to decreasing time to degree, so state legislators and other stakeholders, parents, guardians, even students themselves, they're also interested in decreasing time to degree because what that means is that they leave with less student debt. Also, research has shown that if students can leave with less student debt and they can get out of college and into the workforce quicker, then they can earn more money over the lifetime of over their lifetime, and then use that money to invest in things like homes, in the market, and also to develop families. So this is, that's a valid thing to be concerned about, time to degree measures. But we're also interested in, from a political perspective, increasing retention and graduation rates, right? So higher education is about educating students, helping them to earn a degree, and then and also retaining them year after year. Because if a student leaves after his or her sophomore year, then that's not necessarily a waste of 2 years, but it doesn't maximize the learning outcomes that that student would be able to do if he or she were able to go through all 4 years. So all of this is to say that there's a lot of things that are driving institutions to look at learning analytics. So what about the end goals for students themselves? Well, there are 3 themes I want to pull out here. First is personalization, second is prediction, and third is intervention. So if we have more data about students and we better understand student behaviors and learning outcomes and also student interests, then we can personalize the educational experience with different resources. We can improve the academic experience by making sure that students get the resources that they need and that are relevant to their interests at the exact time that they need them. A lot of this also comes down to prediction. So we want to know if a student is at risk of X or has an improbability of succeeding at Y. So maybe that's math. And maybe that's getting through what we often call bottleneck courses in higher education. So those prerequisite courses that a lot of students have trouble with, but they need to get through it in order to move on to their core courses in their degree program. Maybe students are not necessarily at risk of an academic outcome, a poor academic outcome, but maybe it's a social outcome. Maybe by having all this data about students, we could better understand if they're embedded into the university community. And sometimes that can be an indicator of poor academic success as well. But we can do all this prediction, or we can do more prediction, I should say, because we have more data. And as I like to say, it's the statistician's mantra that more data equals more power. And so if we have more data, we have more power to make more predictions with higher degree of trust, though there are some limitations to that. And I've kind of hinted at intervention strategies already, is that we want to use this data to bring to the mind of the student that things possibly aren't going right in his or her academic career. And that we want to, as caring professionals, whether we're advisors or instructors or librarians, or we work in student services in some way, we want to help them become the best that they can be and achieve the greatest level of success. And if we're seeing in the data that there's a problem, then some people argue that we have an obligation to act on that data. And that obligation to act becomes an intervention strategy of some sort. And we'll talk about interventions related to academic libraries and learning analytics here in a little bit. So we need to dig into the data and the info, the information that is informing all of these learning analytics practices. Because the success of learning analytics depends on the ability of the institution to aggregate and analyze data. So learning analytics is often characterized, and I should put that in the first person, I characterize learning analytics as a big data practice because it is more than just looking at one source of data. It's about combining a lot of different data from a lot of different systems over time to not only better understand an individual student, but also develop profiles about students so that we can act on it. And it's not necessarily limited to just institutional data and information. Many of the strongest advocates for learning analytics argue that they need to look off campus to things like social media data to better understand student behaviors. But even if they don't look off campus, higher education is awash in identifiable student data. There is no dearth of student data in higher education. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the following slides. But so to these ends, institutions are creating data infrastructures and building capacity for data analytics, and they're doing these things in a lot of different ways. So I've seen institutions really make strategic hires. People who do educational data mining or who are considered to be data scientists, they're hiring individuals like that. They are looking to expand the scope of what institutional research offices do. They're enhancing the professional development opportunities, especially for faculty, to learn how to do smaller scale data analytics. And generally, they're just changing or modifying departmental activities to better understand or better get at the value embedded in all the student data. So let's go over some of these data and information sources. And I'm going to break this down in 4 different ways: digital breadcrumbs, admissions and student records, identification systems, and biometrics. So let's talk about digital breadcrumbs first. So digital breadcrumbs are bits of identifiable data that are created by any number of information systems. So whether that's your learning management system or your communication systems, so maybe that's it. Maybe your institution is contracted out with Google to provide Gmail, or maybe they're contracted out with Microsoft to provide Microsoft's email account, which I cannot think of at the moment. Anything a student touches in terms of an information system has the potential to drop or create digital breadcrumbs. And this is just a standard part of information system design. Often these information systems need to log or create a record of how users interact with them in order to provide either an experience or a service or a feature that is tailored to the individual user or just generally meets that user's needs. And now the part that makes digital breadcrumbs so interesting is that they can be extracted out from those information systems, usually embedded in relational databases, and used for secondary purposes or analyzed for secondary purposes. And what these breadcrumbs often look like, or what they tell about a student, is they can be attached to timestamps or be timestamped that can reveal temporal behaviors. So when students did a certain action or committed a certain event at a particular time, at a particular date, down to the second. And you could also use those timestamps to understand a history of behaviors in a particular information system. So when we talk about the learning management system, for instance, whether that's Canvas or Desire to Learn or Blackboard, Moodle, whatever your LMS of choice is, there are digital breadcrumbs being left that can help us understand when a student enters into a course, what actions the student takes, like where she or he clicks in that course site, for how long he or she stays in a particular on a particular learning object, and so on. And these things, as I say, reveal behaviors and when they are done. And additionally, they develop these click trails. And that's kind of what I was getting at, is that they reveal interactions with content. So from an instructional perspective, I may be interested in how many of my students in my information policy course actually click on the lecture or actually download the readings. That would be a click trail that I could then analyze. But that click trail wasn't necessarily developed for learning analytics in mind. And then finally, archived content can reveal communications, thoughts, and ideas. And this is where we're getting to things like emails and messages, instant messages within our information systems, or chat logs in our webinar systems that we use, or at the simplest level, the content left in our discussion forums in our learning management systems. So what about admissions and student records? So admissions are a trove of data and information on which learning analytics relies. Because these admissions applications includes a lot about a student's academic achievement, his or her demographic and socioeconomic information. Sometimes these admissions records require students to talk about their reading habits and interests, or their cultural interests, and even some of their, political or social beliefs. They also reveal disciplinary and criminal history. So if a student has been convicted and has a felony record, that has to be reported. Perhaps there are some other high school disciplinary records that come along with those with those admissions applications. And increasingly, these admissions applications, especially if you're at a private institution that has a religious affiliation, require students to reveal their religion, sometimes even their sexual preference or gender identity. So I earned my bachelor's degree at Elmhurst College, which is in the western suburbs of Chicago, and they were the first institution, in fact this was talked about on the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I believe also in the New York Times, the first institution to ask for a student's sexual preference, to see whether or not they were a part of the LGBTQ community. And the argument from Elmhurst College was, if we know that information, then we can craft resources and services to better serve that community. I think that's defensible and that's justifiable, but there's also a question of how they're storing that data, how they're securing it, how they're making sure that there are no extraneous and perhaps nefarious downstream uses of this data and information. And those concerns apply to all the other data and information being gathered for learning analytics as well. I do want to bring your eyes up to that second bullet point, the standardized testing profiles. So when a student takes a standardized test, an ACT, or in this case a PSAT, the PSAT also asks for a lot of profile information. And that profile information is oftentimes, or actually it is, I shouldn't say oftentimes, it is not required. But yet, students are in a very stressful situation. They just want to get through the test. They want to make sure that they're not missing out on anything that may disqualify them. This is a test that is very consequential for their ability to get into a college or university of their choice. And so these profiles are developed about these students that the College Board, which administers the test, actually sells to institutions and other third parties in order to recruit students. So institutions have access to these testing profiles as well. And then just related to what I would call traditional academic records, this is information that is stored in the Student Information System, the SIS as it's often called. And it's a repository of academic records. It does include some of the information that was on the application for admission, but it's more related to course enrollment and progress towards degree. What about identification systems? So one of the things that I argue is that higher education has a leg, an arm, a torso, a whole body ahead of commercial entities like Target and Amazon because they have a closed information infrastructure, which is to say that for students to use any of the information systems on campus, they typically have to identify themselves. They typically have to say, this is who I am, this is what I'm trying to access. And in doing so, those behaviors can, as detailed in the digital breadcrumbs, can be related to the student's identity as he or she moves throughout all of these information systems and connects to all of these wireless networks. Additionally, students have a student ID, and they use this ID card to, among other things, enter into their dorm rooms or make purchases at the student union or at the bookstore. Those purchases are hooked up into a banking system. Sometimes a third party contracts with the university to provide banking services through the student ID. And I know for a fact that there are institutions who are looking to analyze some of these purchasing behaviors by their students. They also use these card swipes to do things like attend events or sign into lectures and basically show that they were present at something that perhaps is required for a course. And then there's RFID. In library land, we know RFID chips is being embedded in library materials so that we can do collection management much easier. But these things are also embedded in student IDs, and they use those to get access to secure areas like special labs or, again, their dorm rooms, or even to get in and out of a campus parking spot. And then there's something that I find to be very disconcerting, which is biometrics. So some institutions are looking to use Fitbit devices to better analyze the signals given off by the body, right? Like get their heart rate, their sleep patterns, how many calories they burn. And at Oral Roberts University, this is actually required. And they make an argument, yeah, Kimberly, that's my response too, is, oh, wow. Oral Roberts University makes a very interesting argument that they're trying to educate and support the whole student, which includes the student's physical well-being. But the problem with Oral Roberts' argument, in my mind, is that they also take all of this data from the Fitbits, they integrate it into the learning management system, and then it's graded by the instructors. This is very much an edge case, by the way, but it shows you how some people argue for this type of data. And then there's been biometric devices that have been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do very similar things, to better understand the outputs of the body in order to look into things like student engagement in a class. Other universities have looked into facial recognition software, especially in large lecture halls. So instead of taking attendance, because taking attendance in a lecture hall of 100, 250, 300 people, that's extremely difficult, if not impossible. They can use a camera to track attendance based on the facial recognition, understanding a student's face and attaching that face to one's identity. And also to make some measures of engagement, so whether or not a student is expressing interest in the topic or the lecture as recorded by the camera. If I were to have my face recognized in a course, I'm sure they would think, their analysis would be that Kyle's always angry because my eyebrows go together and I look like I'm just really having a hard time or very frustrated with my teacher, but that's just what my face looks like. So I would be concerned about being in a class with this type of technology. So what does this all get us to? Well, it's a fact that learning analytics is a data-driven surveillance practice, and surveillance as a term usually brings up some red flags. It's concerning to some people, but surveillance is a neutral term. You have to kind of contextualize it to better understand if the surveillance is for good or for bad. And this is in the literature called Dataveillance. So data-driven surveillance is called Dataveillance. And it's the interconnection of information systems and databases to develop digital dossiers, so electronic records, very comprehensive electronic records, or what are also called data doubles of students. And these data doubles are supposed to be a copy of a student's real life that makes him or her analyzable. And the dataveillance systems increase opportunities for data dredging. So that's to gather all this data, but you don't really have a research question, and then you're just going to throw different variables at it to find correlations. That's the basics of data dredging. And you do these things to find behavioral patterns, to develop predictions, and intervene in student life. But learning analytics requires, for it to have large-scale transformative success, it really depends on the systemic and systematic data collection. What is argued for in the literature with regard to institutional kind of transformation or reform requires not small data sets, but all the data that these institutions can get. So let's get into the problems, the ethics of it. So problem number one, the burden of surveillance. So it may be that all students are equally surveilled. So students A, B, and C are all given the same type of attention via the Dataveillance technologies. But it may also be that some students, like student A, may become the target of intense surveillance. And some students may be targeted more than others because they're student athletes. So student athletes are already surveilled heavily, especially their social media presence, because they are very, I don't want to say popular so much, but they're representatives of the institution in a way that sometimes non-student athletes are. This surveillance may also target students whose socioeconomic background is predictive of a higher failure attrition rate. So students who come from a poorer community or a poorer household. That situation is usually used as a proxy for other things, low educational attainment, or being in a family structure that can't necessarily support the student as well in his or her learning growth. They may use this to target those students to better improve the retention of those students, right? Remember, retention is a big goal. Or they may target students who express behaviors or make choices that run counter to the aims of learning analytics. Doesn't necessarily mean that the student is going to learn less. It doesn't necessarily mean that the student is not going to be retained, but maybe that student is just doing things, whatever those things are and however defined, that run counter to what the institution thinks the student should be doing. Problem number two, the distribution of benefits. So whose interests are served and who benefits? So it could be the institution, it could be just the administrator, it could be just the instructor, or hopefully students do benefit as well. But benefits may not redound to students. Students may not be, especially this generation of students, may not get the full benefit of learning analytics. Perhaps all of the data gathered about students today is only going to inform the next generation of students, right? It's because we're developing all the predictive capabilities now, we're testing it on this generation of students, and we're going to perfect it now for the second generation. I also want to point out kind of the politics around data. So no data is ever raw, no data is ever neutral, and as Bowker says, all data should be cooked with care. All of these things, these systems, these algorithms, these databases, they're all embedded with somebody's values, with somebody's agenda. And data can empower or it can disenfranchise people. It can create winners and it can create losers. And while sometimes in the learning analytics literature, advocates of the technology believe that learning analytics is a panacea for higher education's problems, it's not. This is a highly complex issue, higher education. We've been studying it for hundreds of years. Not one system, not one technology, not one way of doing things will solve all of the problems. Problem 4, student privacy. So just because we can surveil students doesn't necessarily mean we should do it. And we have to be aware that privacy is valuable for a lot of different reasons. One, privacy helps us to build relationships. Privacy helps us to keep information disclosures to a minimum until a point where we think it's okay to disclose information about ourselves, where we trust that other individual to do with that information things that we think will not only benefit us, but benefit our relationships. Also, privacy provides us a space to make and learn from mistakes, right? If we're always worried that our mistakes are going to be recorded and analyzed and perhaps disclosed downstream, we're not going to be taking many risks anymore. And higher education is about risk-taking, both socially and intellectually. And students need a place where they can take those risks and make some mistakes. I know I did as an undergraduate. Hopefully I made less mistakes as a doc student. But yeah, we need those places to be able to explore. And privacy can be a condition necessary to explore intellectual materials and develop ideas in speech. and that should sound familiar to you as LAS professionals. That brings us to libraries and learning analytics. So how they're using it and to what ends, academic libraries and learning analytics. So this is a significant shift in library evaluation. So this is a shift from studying student experience in libraries to student achievement. We started a little bit of this in 2011 with the ACRL report. And today, more than ever, accreditors and other stakeholders want proof that library practices are aligned with institutional needs and that library resources and services improve learning outcomes. Basically, they want to know if their investments are justified in the library. So librarians are looking for statistical evidence showing relationships between their work and collections with things like student learning outcomes, retention, and achievement. But the problem with this is kind of a move towards big data scientism, is that we trust all this data that we can get, and that's really the only thing that we can believe is valuable, is looking at all this data and doing all this data analysis. I have a colleague down at IU Bloomington who argues, well, what about doing anthropological studies? What about doing qualitative studies? What about asking students questions instead of surveilling their life? There are alternatives to just surveilling students and analyzing their life. So Megan Oakleaf, who is at Syracuse, says that until libraries know that student number 5 with major A has downloaded B number of articles from database C or checked out D number of books, participated in e-workshops and online tutorials, and completed courses F, G, and H, libraries cannot correlate any of those student information behaviors with attainment of other outcomes. Until librarians do that, until they get this data, they will be blocked in many of their efforts to demonstrate value. And that's a very interesting citation to think about. And it's a strong argument for doing learning analytics in libraries. I don't deny that. And Duderstadt says that the university library may be the most important observation post for studying how students really learn. And I would argue with that as well as being a library advocate. A lot of the intellectual materials that we provide to students in the form of journal articles and physical materials and archives really are at the core of what they do in their higher education experience. So what are libraries doing? So, well, they're tapping into the developing capacities for learning analytics by partnering with institutional researchers and others. So larger scale big data style mining benefits library projects by combining library data with existing data in institutional data warehouses. So our library systems are often divorced from these other systems. They're definitely not aggregated in an institutional data warehouse most of the time. But by putting library system data into this data warehouse, you can start to do those analyses. So a couple of examples. So Huddersfield U and University in the UK wanted to know what the relationship was between undergraduate library usage and degree result. And first to fourth class here is how they categorize their degrees. And their findings were that it increased understanding of usage patterns across disciplines and student levels. There's a positive relationship between book borrowing and degree result, and electronic resource access and degree result. But there was no relationship between library entries and degree results. Example number 2, and this is a prominent one in the United States, University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. So they wanted to know what the relationship was between library usage and undergraduate and graduate student outcomes, such as retention and grade point average. So they aggregated usage data from as many different library services and resources as possible, and found an increased understanding of usage patterns, again, across disciplines and student levels. And in contrast to Huddersfield, they said that undergraduate students who made at least one use of the library in any of the library access points consistently had higher semester GPAs than students who made no use of the library. I think that's pretty obvious, but now there's some data to back it up. And then the University of Wollongong is a really interesting one because they created their own kind of data warehouse with library system data and imported some other student information system data. And they found, or they looked at the total number of student item loans and electronic usage information from proxy logs and access points and timestamps and all this stuff. And they actually shared the analytics with the instructor. So they made an assumption that students are at academic risk when resource usage is low. So when resource usage is low, it's time for an intervention. And this is what they said about the intervention. The act of intervention has been positive when students have been contacted by their lecturer to query their limited use of library resources. Uptake was immediate. I have significant problems with this, I have to say. One, this information in this journal, and I've read a lot of Janti's pieces, does not actually say that students pursued materials that helped them learn more. It says that the student went to the library and used stuff, right? Uptake was immediate. Well, why was uptake immediate? Was it because they felt surveilled and they wanted to get the instructor off their back? That's one plausible reason. It could be that they actually did look at useful materials, but it may not necessarily be the case. So we have to be very careful about these interventions. We have to think about how these are influencing students to behave in particular ways. Here's just a little bit of information about the data protections and disclosures between these three studies. So Huddersfield de-identified the data and minimized it. So they didn't get all the data, they just got what they felt they needed. University of Minnesota got much more data, and they kept the data identifiable at a broad level and tracked a student's entry into a database, but not specific queries, right? And they didn't look at what item titles and the metadata associated with those item titles as they were related to an identifiable student. So they weren't really connecting intellectual materials with identifiable students. But the University of Wollongong did. They kept all of the data identifiable, they disclosed it to support interventions, and so there was a much different end of the spectrum here. So the problem is that libraries are beginning to add sensitive intellectual data to digital dossiers by participating, and these dossiers may inform consequential decisions about students, but students don't really have a say in this. There's no informed consent mechanism. And when interventions occur, it's not clear if those interventions simply create more library usage, as I said, or ends-oriented library usage, like using resources for specific purposes. So in the remaining time, I do want to talk about some ethical conflicts. I'm sure some of you are already thinking about these. So in the ALA Code of Ethics, there are two principles that I think conflict with learning analytics participation. First, we uphold the principles of intellectual freedom and resist all efforts to censor library resources, focus on the bold there, and we protect each library user's right to privacy and confidentiality. So intellectual freedom is this moral good that helps people to pursue ideas, develop speech, and build one's identity through that speech. And the Code of Ethics says that intellectual freedom is a form of negative freedom, which is that it's a freedom that depends on the absence of external liberty-reducing forces. And surveillance is usually seen as a liberty-reducing external force. That's why we have problems with the NSA and the FBI and all the other agencies in America who are trying to get access to library materials, often in public libraries, but also in academic libraries, trying to understand what students or users are looking at. So privacy generally concerns spheres of protection against unwanted intrusion in one's life, whether that's physical life or intellectual life or personal life. And the Code of Ethics talks about privacy in terms of intellectual privacy, and that's by Neil Richards. And it says that it argues that by providing protective spheres for intellectual privacy in policy, practice, and design, librarians aim to provide the conditions necessary for intellectual freedom. So is learning analytics actually compatible with library ethics? And the short answer is that I don't think it is. Learning analytics is a surveillance practice. It aims to intrude in students' private lives. It needs to observe and analyze intellectual behaviors, and it looks to shape student life, to actually get students to act in a certain way by intervening in their life, in their academic life, perhaps even in their social life. So if there are these ethical conflicts, then the question is, why are librarians actually participating? So 3 hypotheses, and then we'll get to some Q&A, I think. First, competing values. So there's a pressure to demonstrate the value, right? The value of the library and its relationship to institutional goals. So it may be that institutions are actually forcing librarians to participate in learning analytics. They're saying, this is what the institution is doing. get on board. It doesn't matter if you really care that much about intellectual freedom and intellectual privacy. This is something that we need to do, one, in order to survive, or two, at least to be able to defend against attacks from outside stakeholders. Hypothesis two could be that there are changing informational norms. The academic librarians are just kind of modifying what I would call transmission principles around library-created data, because maybe they don't view information privacy in the same way as we have in the profession over the years, which has been really a conservative use of personally identifiable information. And maybe they have other goals-oriented practices that they want to pursue than protecting privacy. And the third one is compatibility. So academic librarians may believe that learning analytics is actually compatible with intellectual freedom and privacy principles. They may believe they are still respecting student privacy and still holding student data in confidence because it doesn't leave institutional boundaries. It's still staying within the institution. It's not like they're disclosing it to insurers or credit reporters, so therefore privacy is still protected. So that's it for kind of my talking points. So I want to get to some questions and reflections in the time that we have. And I'm willing to stay well past 12:30. I know we're running a little bit behind. But I have 5 questions that I want to show you for 10 seconds each. And I just want you to think about these and reflect on them. And then I want you, if you are willing, to answer one question, the one that speaks to you to the most. And that will kind of help us with an open discussion. So first, what is your reaction as a person and as a library professional to educational data mining? Second, how do you actually define student privacy? Third, how do your information policies as they currently stand at your library address data mining and analysis within the institution? Fourth, how would you react to an administrator requiring you to reveal identifiable student data held within a library system? So we're talking about the ILS or your easy proxy logs or your interlibrary loan systems. And finally, is the profession actually able and ready to have these important conversations around data ethics? So let's go ahead and discuss this. I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the text box, and I'll do my best to answer your questions and responses.
So there is a question from Catherine. She says, even if scenario 3 is true, there are so many third parties involved, there may not really be privacy. Is ALA or ACRL active in fighting this kind of surveillance in academic libraries? If so, how?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Catherine, about the third parties and the role of ACRL or ARL and ALA, a lot of acronyms there, in fighting third-party surveillance. So I was a part of ALA's recent initiative to develop privacy policies around library systems. And I was happy to participate, felt honored to be asked. I was disappointed that it focused on school libraries and public libraries and left academic libraries to not be addressed. So from an ALA perspective, I feel that that organization hasn't done a very good job. And there's work to be done. From an ARL or ACRL, I'll talk about, I believe it's ARL who put out the recent report in combination with OCLC, where they talked about learning analytics. They interviewed administrators, generally about the value of libraries and learning analytics came up. And that's a very large report. I want to say it's 40, 50, 60 pages, something like that. And privacy was given very little of that space. In fact, they talked about the University of Wollongong in Australia as being an exemplar for protecting student privacy. I wouldn't say that the University of Wollongong is an exemplar for protecting student privacy. Again, maybe they are within the institution, but in terms of disclosing library information to other parties, that's questionable in terms of being an exemplar. But, you know, what do we do when it comes to creating contracts with third-party contract providers or third parties who provide services like ebooks or journal articles? Hopefully it's within the contract that there is limited identifiable data being gathered, but as we found out recently, within I want to say the last 5 years, that wasn't the case with Adobe and their ebook service. They were pulling identifiable information. So it's up to us, I think, to hold these people or these institutions and organizations and companies responsible, both in the contracts that we create and by being very aware of our own policies.
Looks like somebody's typing a question or a comment.
Okay, got a question coming.
Oh, Catherine had a comment. She says, I'm actually from a public library, and that's what I'm concerned with most, the third-party policies of user data and how our library protects that data.
Yeah, Catherine, as a public librarian, I think it really does come down to your contracts. And I think most public libraries don't have the legal support that academic libraries do, where they have legal counsel who can look over these contracts and provide a very close eye. And it's going to be more difficult. So in that case, I think it would be good for the ALA to get together and provide some policy recommendations and policy principles that could be included in your contracts with these third parties to protect against the aggregation of identifiable data.
There's a comment from Celia that says, I think that privacy is a hopeful goal, but not really achievable with hackers and other nefarious groups out there.
Yeah, Celia, I think you're right to a degree. I mean, there's always the concern about hackers. There's always the concern about individuals who want to do us harm by using our personally identifiable information. And those individuals are really out of our control. Hopefully they're taken care of by the legal system. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility anymore to protect our students, our staff, people within our libraries, from whom we gather identifiable information. We're not in a completely transparent society yet, even though sometimes it seems that way with social media. We still have ethical and legal responsibilities to do our best, even given the situations, as you bring up, that can limit our ability to protect privacy. But privacy has value. I think we need a refreshing course on why privacy has value, because as I've spoken in conversations I've had with administrators, they often point out that, well, students don't care about privacy. They're on social media. It doesn't matter. We can analyze their lives if we want because it's just normal for them. But the emerging literature specifically focused on student privacy or student perspectives of their privacy as it relates to learning analytics says a completely different thing. It says that they actually do care about certain types of data being gathered. They actually do care about how it's analyzed. They actually do want the right to be informed and consent to some of these practices.
We have a comment, and yeah, we have two comments. Celia says, I agree, we should continue to try, just think it is very hard to achieve. And that's in response to your comment. And then Catherine says, you asked how to define student privacy, and I think that should that should involve making data non-identifiable. A challenge, yes, but it should be the goal.
Yeah, that's, Catherine, that's a lofty goal, to make data non-identifiable, especially given the way that in higher education, the information infrastructures are set up to, at the beginning, identify students and connect those students to online behaviors. So I actually, it's interesting that you brought this up, because I actually just wrote this in a paper that I sent off to a journal, that it doesn't, to my eye, it does not seem possible to start at an anonymous level anymore with data. And instead, it's going to be about very careful de-identification, very careful information disclosures, and being cognizant of the fact that it's very easy to re-identify students when massive amounts of data are put back together. That's the problem with big data, is that de-identification or re-identification of data is very simple.
Looks like somebody else, Catherine's typing.
While people are finishing up typing or thinking about their questions, I do just want to reiterate again that my contact information is on the slide. If you want to continue these conversations after the webinar, I'd be happy to do so.
And just got a couple more minutes for folks who are still here. I did give a link to the survey. Please make sure you fill out the survey for today's webinar. Catherine's comment, it puts librarians especially in a difficult spot, especially if they're probably going to want to inform students about privacy and then at the same time track their data so closely for institutional purposes.
Yeah, that's the conflict, isn't it? It's how do we use this data to support our goals and advance our interests as a library, but how do we do what we think I would say as a profession we have an obligation to do, which is to protect the privacy of our users, as it says so in our ALA Code of Ethics. I don't think it's impossible, even though perhaps my tone in this presentation and sometimes in my writing it seems that way, that it seems impossible to do both. But I think it's absolutely possible to analyze this data in ways that still take into consideration student privacy and what students think of their privacy. So I think actually that's the more important part, is that we need to provide these consent mechanisms that allow students to say, I'm okay with this, or I'm not okay with this. So if we can educate students, and this is really the important part, if we can educate students about learning analytics, if we can justify what these practices are, if we can be transparent with them about what we're trying to achieve and still give them a say in the practice, in all of these different initiatives, then I think we can get to a closer balance. We can say, look, we are doing our best to protect your privacy. Here's why we want to protect your privacy. Also understand that we also want to give you a very good educational experience. And this is how we're trying to do this.
And Catherine says, glad you're researching this.
Thanks, me too, it's fun.
And Catherine says, thanks and good luck with your work.